Put your hands behind your back, Ron barked, puffing out his chest like a security guard at a rock concert. Except this wasn't a concert, and he wasn't security. He was just a middle-aged man in khaki shorts, aviator sunglasses, and a Walmart-style badge that said HOA Enforcer. My 14-year-old nephew Dylan blinked at him, skateboard still rolling beside his foot on the driveway. "Are you serious?" Dylan asked, half laughing, half confused. "Serious as a heart attack," Ron replied, producing a pair of plastic zip-tie cuffs like he was starring in his own bootleg cop show. And before I could get across the yard, Ron actually handcuffed my nephew, on our own property, claiming he was violating HOA noise protocol. That's when I called my sister. She didn't answer right away. That's because she was getting off a chopper after finishing an FBI operation in 3 states. She called back 4 minutes later. Her voice was calm. "I'll be there in 5. And 5 minutes later, she was still in her field gear, still wearing her badge. And when she stepped out of the SUV and saw her son zip-tied on the ground and a fake cop standing over him, all hell, and I do mean all hell, broke loose. It started earlier that day like any other lazy Saturday. I was in town visiting my sister Marissa and her son Dylan, hoping for a quiet weekend filled with bad movies, pizza, and maybe a round of mini-golf. Dylan's an easygoing kid, smart, sarcastic, and a little too into skateboarding videos. He'd just gotten a new board and was trying tricks in the driveway, falling, laughing, and getting back up. Harmless stuff. No music, no swearing, no crowd. Just a 14-year-old being a 14-year-old. Then came the whir of electric wheels. A golf cart rounded the cul-de-sac like a low-speed shark and parked diagonally across the sidewalk, as if the guy driving it thought he was conducting a felony stop. Out stepped Ron. If you've ever seen someone take themselves way too seriously while doing something completely ridiculous, you've seen Ron. He had tactical boots on with his shorts, a tucked-in polo shirt with a stitched patch that read Community Safety, and a cheap earpiece that wasn't even plugged in. "State your name," he said, pointing at Dylan. Dylan looked up, squinting. "What?" "Name. Address. HOA ID if you have it. You are in violation of noise ordinances and possible property damage. This is your official warning." I stepped outside then, holding a slice of pizza. "Hey man, he's just skating on our driveway. Chill." Ron turned to me like I'd spit in his cereal. "Sir, I am conducting an HOA enforcement. Please do not interfere." "You're not a cop," I said, baffled. "I'm HOA certified," he snapped back. "We have protocols." Then, with zero warning, he pulled out a zip-tie cuff, grabbed Dylan by the wrist, and in one smooth motion locked his hands behind his back. Dylan yelped. I dropped the pizza. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, running over. Detainment under Clause 8.3 of the Community Code, failure to comply with authority. I tried to stop myself from laughing. "You're kidding, right?" Ron didn't smile. "You're lucky I don't write you up for obstruction." I pulled out my phone, called Marissa, and explained in about 6 seconds that Ron the HOA lunatic had zip-tied her son on our own driveway. "I'm on my way," she said, her voice ice-cold. Meanwhile, a small crowd had formed. A neighbor from across the street filmed the whole thing, whispering commentary like he was streaming it live. 2 kids biking past stopped and stared like they'd just seen a live episode of Cops, Suburbia edition. Dylan sat on the ground, hands behind his back, looking more annoyed than afraid. "Dude, this is illegal," he said. "My mom's literally FBI." "Sure she is," Ron said with a scoff, pacing in front of him. "They all say that when they're caught." "Caught doing what?" I shouted. "Landing a trick?" Ron ignored me. "I'm just waiting for real authorities to back me up. We'll see how funny you think it is then." Spoiler, he never called anyone. Because he knew, deep down, he had no right. No badge. No authority. No idea who he was messing with. 5 minutes later, a black SUV with government plates rolled up like a ghost. No lights. No sirens. Just slow, steady menace. When the door opened, out stepped my sister, still in her dark field uniform, belt loaded, badge shining, hair pulled back like someone not to be trifled with. She didn't yell. She didn't flinch. She just walked up, looked at her son, then looked at Ron. "Let him go," she said, calm as steel. Ron blinked. "And you are?" She pulled the badge from her hip and held it inches from his face. "Special Agent Marissa Kane, FBI." That was the moment Ron's fake confidence cracked like a dropped vase. His lips parted. His eyes flicked between the badge, her face, the crowd, and the zip ties. "Your badge is real," he muttered. "Very. Unlike yours," she said, snapping a photo of his ridiculous plastic badge with her phone. "You just committed unlawful detainment of a minor, impersonated law enforcement, and possibly violated multiple federal codes regarding citizen right. I hope you've got a good lawyer." Ron finally reached down to remove the zip ties, fumbling like his fingers forgot how to work. "Too late for that," Marissa said, holding up her phone. "I already called local PD. You'll want to be here when they arrive." Ron looked around like a man on the edge. No one moved to help him. Everyone had their phones out. And Dylan? He stood up and rubbed his wrists, grinning like someone who just watched the last boss go down in flames. "You messed with the wrong kid," he said. And Ron knew it. By the time the police arrived, Ron looked like a man who had just woken up from a long, arrogant dream. His arms hung stiffly at his sides, jaw tight, eyes darting anywhere but at Marissa. The responding officers, two young but no-nonsense local cops, took one look at the scene. Teenager with red marks on his wrists, a crowd of witnesses, Marissa's badge, and didn't need much convincing. They separated Ron, asked for his ID, and started writing notes while trying not to laugh at the homemade badge that said HOA Enforcement Division. It had an eagle on it. The eagle was holding a mailbox. Ron stammered explanations, flipping between righteous anger and panicked backpedaling. He claimed he was performing community safety duties, as a member of the HOA's Special Response Team. The officers looked at each other and then at Marissa. "Does this HOA have a special response team?" one asked. Marissa folded her arms. "Not unless they've secretly been training mall cops in boot camps." Dylan sat in the back of the SUV, sipping a juice box someone's mom had brought from her porch cooler, like a guest of honor at a cookout. He looked surprisingly chill for someone who had just been zip-tied by a man in tactical croc. Once the officers escorted Ron to his ridiculous golf cart for a voluntary search, Marissa and I went inside with Dylan. That's when Marissa dropped into work mode. She started asking questions, not just about what happened, but about what Ron said, how he approached, what tools he had, how long he'd been doing this. She had that look in her eyes. The one that said, "This isn't over." We pulled up the neighborhood forum. There it was. Dozens of posts over the past few months about someone leaving fake HOA warnings on doors, moving trash bins to correct positions, reporting cars parked too long even in private driveways. Many thought it was just an overly eager board member. A few had even tried to thank the guy, thinking he was some volunteer going above and beyond. But as we scrolled, a pattern emerged. Ron wasn't just enforcing imaginary rules. He was doing it only to specific families. Mostly newcomers. Mostly anyone who pushed back on the HOA. Marissa sent a message to a friend in local law enforcement. Within an hour, she got confirmation. The HOA had no authorized enforcement officers. No patrol division. No sanction for any resident to detain another, use zip ties, or conduct property searches. Ron had zero authority. That night, Marissa started digging into county records. Turns out Ron wasn't even listed as a board member. Not current. Not past. Not ever. He had no title, no position. Just a name in the resident database like anyone else. So how had no one stopped him? The answer came through a message on the neighborhood app from a user named Clover78, an anonymous profile that messaged Marissa directly. It said, He's not acting alone. Ask about the handshake agreement. That's all it said. But it was enough to light a fire. The next morning, Marissa went straight to the HOA office, a small rented room in the community center that had all the charm of a DMV crossed with a dentist's waiting room. She asked to speak with the board president. The receptionist, a nervous young woman barely out of college, went pale when she saw Marissa's badge. The board president, a balding man named Gary with a tan that screamed golf addict, came out 10 minutes later with a forced smile. "Agent Kane," he said, eyes doing a quick scan of her badge. "What brings the federal government to our little neighborhood?" "You already know," she said. "I'm here about Ron, your so-called enforcer." Gary laughed a little too loudly. "Ron's just an enthusiastic resident. Maybe he oversteps now and then, but he means well. He handcuffed a minor." That stopped the smile. Gary stammered something about misunderstandings, about how the board never gave him real authority. "He just likes to feel useful." "So useful you let him run around in a fake uniform with a badge, detaining kids and putting up cameras?" Gary blinked. "Cameras? Wrong answer." Marissa leaned in. "You didn't know about the cameras?" He looked away, hesitated. Then, "We didn't authorize any surveillance." "Not officially." "Unofficially," she pressed. He shook his head fast. "Look, some of the other board members might have made an agreement with him. Just to keep things orderly. There were complaints. Trash left out. Wrong paint colors. Renters. It's been hard to maintain standards." "So you gave a vigilante free rein to harass people," Marissa said, voice sharp now. "I didn't," Gary said. "But I didn't stop it either. That was enough." Back at home, Marissa opened a case file. It wasn't just about Ron anymore. Now it was about the HOA's complicity. A neighbor sent over footage of Ron installing what looked like a small camera inside a fake birdhouse. Another neighbor found a strange blinking light on their fence post. Turns out it was a motion tracker. Marissa called in a few favors. A small team from the Bureau's cyber division dropped by that evening in a nondescript van. They went house to house scanning for devices. In total, they found 8 hidden cameras, motion alerts, data logs, all feeding into a hard drive found in Ron's garage when the police returned with a warrant. The garage was its own revelation. A wall covered in map. Resident schedules printed out and pinned like some kind of crime show storyboard. Lists of cars, license plates, facial snapshots from camera feed. And folders. So many folders. Labeled with last names. Marissa found one that said, "Kane Family, Priority Risk." The agent next to her whistled. "He's been building a dossier. And weaponizing it," Marissa added. That night, news spread like wildfire. Someone posted a photo of the FBI van parked outside Ron's house. Within hours, it was all over the community forum. The post read, "Fake HOA cop turns out to be a suburban spy. FBI involved. You won't believe what he had on us." It got over 2,000 upvotes and was shared across Reddit under r/EntitledPeople and r/legaladvice. People from other communities started chiming in, some claiming they'd had similar Ron-type figures in their neighborhoods. The next morning, Ron was officially charged. Impersonating law enforcement, illegal detainment, unlawful surveillance. And that was just the beginning. Because what Marissa was really after, the real storm coming, wasn't just Ron. It was the HOA board members who had quietly encouraged him, given him verbal permission, allowed a system of unofficial punishment in exchange for plausible deniability. As Marissa sipped her coffee and looked out at the quiet neighborhood, she said one thing that stuck with me. "It's not just about one man pretending to have power," she said. "It's about the people who let him pretend. And that's where this ends." The neighborhood changed almost overnight. Ron's house, once the creepy fortress of a self-appointed HOA enforcer, now looked more like a haunted relic. His golf cart was gone, towed away by the police for evidence. The fake security signs on his lawn had been yanked out, and someone had taped a drawing of a clown to his mailbox with the words, "Neighborhood Watch This," written underneath. The street, once quiet and compliant, had come alive with whispers, murmurs, and, most importantly, outrage. For years, people had tiptoed around Ron's rules, thinking he was just an eccentric stickler with a little too much authority. Now they knew the truth, and they were furious. Marissa didn't even have to rally the neighbors. They came to her. Some dropped by with flash drives and screenshots of warnings they'd received, unofficial citations with fake legal language that Ron had printed himself. Others brought stories, some funny, some disturbing. One woman said Ron once followed her for 2 blocks because her recycling bin had foreign items in it. A teenager explained how Ron accused him of loitering on his own front steps and threatened to call immigration. A young couple, visibly shaken, shared how Ron had taken photos of their children playing in the yard, claiming he was monitoring potential hazards. It was bigger than anyone thought. And Ron wasn't the only problem. One name kept coming up during the complaints: Sandra Wilkes, HOA board treasurer. Sandra was polite in public, the type to wear pearls and carry a clipboard, but apparently, she was the quiet power behind many of Ron's so-called directives. Residents remembered her always showing up after Ron issued a warning, often with thinly veiled threats about fines or future consequences if homeowners didn't cooperate. When Marissa looked into it, she discovered that Sandra had been signing off on false HOA violation notices and retroactively approving Ron's actions, covering their tracks with made-up bylaws and vague minutes from private meetings. It was a quiet little dictatorship, all hidden under the guise of maintaining community standards. Marissa compiled everything. The FBI wasn't just pursuing Ron anymore. They were now formally investigating the HOA board for collusion, misuse of authority, and violation of federal privacy laws. But before any of that came to light publicly, Marissa had one more idea. She wanted the community to understand the full scope of what had been happening, to see with their own eyes what this fake authority had done to them. So, she hosted a neighborhood meeting. They called it the HOA Truth Session, and it was held in the local community center's gym. Word spread quickly. The night of the meeting, the place was packed. Standing room only. Families brought lawn chairs, snacks, even notebooks. Someone brought a projector. Another neighbor had laminated Ron's fake citations and pinned them to a corkboard like a museum exhibit. Dylan and a few teens created a meme slideshow that opened the night to uproarious laughter. But once the laughs faded, Marissa took the floor. She laid it all out. The illegal detainment, the cameras, the fake badges, the cooperation from certain board members. She even showed redacted images from Ron's garage, the tracking charts, the resident profiles, and the heat maps of where people walked their dogs. Audible gasps rippled through the room. Marissa didn't hold back. She explained how Ron had used scare tactics, how board members gave him verbal support and later covered up his actions, and how that power vacuum had allowed a man with no legal authority to control an entire neighborhood. When she finished, there was silence. Not awkward silence, stunned, reflective silence. Then the questions started. Who else knew? What about the fines people had paid? Were they legal? Could they get their money back? Was anyone going to jail? Marissa answered everything she could, and what she couldn't, she promised to pursue. By the end of the meeting, something had shifted. These weren't just angry neighbors anymore. They were united, and they wanted change. The next day, the community launched a petition to dissolve the current HOA board and install a new, temporary oversight committee. Within 48 hours, over 90% of the neighborhood had signed it. The board tried to fight it, but the momentum was too strong. Gary resigned first. Then 2 more board members stepped down. Sandra, however, dug in her heels. She denied everything, claimed Ron acted independently, and even tried to suggest Marissa had fabricated evidence to intimidate the board. That was her final mistake. 3 days later, federal agents arrived at Sandra's house with a search warrant. They seized HOA documents, financial records, and communications with Ron, emails that clearly showed she not only knew what Ron was doing but had actively encouraged it. One message even read, "Let Ron handle it. He's good at scaring the troublemakers." Sandra was arrested and charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding in unlawful surveillance. Her mugshot was on the evening news. As for Ron, things only got worse. Investigators discovered he had submitted fake invoices to the HOA for security services, totaling over $15,000 over 2 years. That opened the door for fraud charges. Then came the biggest twist. One of the recovered camera feeds had accidentally captured a completely unrelated felony: a local contractor dumping illegal chemicals into a nearby storm drain. The footage became key evidence in a separate environmental investigation. Ron had stumbled into real crime while pretending to fight fake ones. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Dylan, meanwhile, had become something of a local celebrity. Kids high-fived him at school. A podcast asked to interview him. He turned it down but did agree to appear in a short video PSA with Marissa titled, "Know Your Rights: What to Do When Authority Isn't Real." The video went viral. By the end of the week, the neighborhood didn't just feel safer, it felt awake. People were talking to each other more, organizing game nights, offering help with yard work, even planning a community garden. It was like they had been freed from an invisible leash they didn't realize was choking them. Marissa stayed low-key, never taking credit, but it was clear who had flipped the whole neighborhood upside down and then helped them put it back together. As she stood in her front yard one evening, arms crossed, watching Dylan skate in peace while neighbors waved hello, I asked her if she was satisfied. "Not yet," she said. "There's still the trial." "Think it'll go public?" I asked. She gave a small smile. "Oh, it's going to be very public. I'm going to make sure of it." And something in her voice made it clear. This wasn't just about Ron or the HOA. This was about every time someone abuses fake power and expects no consequences. This time, they picked the wrong house, the wrong kid, and absolutely the wrong mother. The courtroom smelled like old paper, cheap coffee, and tension. It was standing room only, packed with neighbors, reporters, and a few curious onlookers who clearly just wanted to see what kind of man pretended to be a cop, detained a teenager, and ended up with federal charges. Ron sat at the defendant's table, wearing a wrinkled suit that looked like it had been bought in a panic. His hair was combed stiffly to one side, and for the first time, he didn't have that smug look of authority on his face. He looked small, uncertain, and vaguely nauseous. Across from him sat the real professionals, Marissa and the federal prosecutor, calm and focused, backed by a mountain of evidence and an even taller wall of community outrage. It started slow, like all trials do. The opening statements painted very different pictures. Ron's attorney, a jittery man with a stammer, tried to frame Ron as a well-meaning citizen who was simply trying to keep his neighborhood safe. He claimed Ron had no malicious intent, that he was encouraged by vague comments from HOA members, and that he genuinely thought he was within his rights. He even tried floating the idea that Ron had a misunderstood sense of duty. It was a stretch, a cartoonishly desperate one. People in the audience snickered under their breath. Then came the prosecution. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't need to. They laid out the facts with surgical precision. Ron had impersonated an officer, detained a minor without authority, installed hidden cameras on private property, and submitted fraudulent invoices to the HOA. They showed screenshots of Ron's fake badges, photos of zip ties in his garage, and emails between him and the HOA board members that made it painfully clear this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a calculated abuse of power. But the turning point came when Marissa took the stand. She was direct, composed, and utterly unshakable. The courtroom fell silent as she recounted the moment she arrived to find her son zip-tied on their driveway. She described her years in federal service, her understanding of what legal authority looks like, and the sheer disbelief she felt seeing a man in cargo shorts and a fake badge standing over her child. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. Every word landed with quiet force. And when Ron's attorney tried to rattle her by suggesting she overreacted, Marissa calmly pointed to the law books on the judge's bench and invited him to pick a page, any page, on unlawful detainment. He didn't take the bait. Next came the HOA twist. A subpoenaed board member named Trudy, who had resigned a week earlier, was called to the stand. Under oath, she cracked. She admitted that the board knew Ron wasn't authorized, but said that Sandra and Gary insisted on keeping him around because he was effective. When pressed on what that meant, she stammered and finally said, "He scared people into compliance." The courtroom gasped. She went on to explain how they'd given Ron verbal clearance to act as a neighborhood stabilizer and that they quietly reimbursed him under made-up budget lines like beautification services and noise control initiatives. That was the nail in the coffin. The judge, who up until that moment had been fairly reserved, leaned forward and asked to review those reimbursements. When the financial records were shown, the judge's eyebrows practically launched off his forehead. Thousands of dollars had been funneled to Ron under false pretenses. It wasn't just impersonation or detainment anymore. It was fraud and conspiracy. Federal charges were adjusted in real time. Ron didn't testify. His lawyer advised against it. Probably a smart move since the last time Ron opened his mouth in public, he tried to give someone a citation for having overly aggressive flowers. But that didn't save him. Not with the mountain of digital evidence, video footage, witness testimonies, and HOA board members all but throwing him under the bus. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. Impersonation of law enforcement, unlawful detention, illegal surveillance, wire fraud, conspiracy. The judge didn't mince words in sentencing. He called Ron's actions a theatrical display of power without purpose and a disturbing example of how unchecked ego can metastasize into community-level tyranny. Ron was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, with no chance of parole for at least 4. He was also fined and ordered to pay restitution to those he targeted. But the fallout didn't end with Ron. Sandra Wilkes, the former treasurer, was sentenced to 18 months for her role in enabling and covering up Ron's activities. Gary, the HOA president, managed to cut a deal in exchange for full cooperation and was slapped with hefty fines and banned from serving on any community board for 10 years. The remaining HOA board members stepped down or were removed. The HOA itself was temporarily dissolved and placed under county supervision until a proper, legally compliant structure could be rebuilt from scratch. The trial made headlines. Local news stations ran back-to-back segments on it for days. National media even picked it up briefly under the banner of "When Neighborhood Watch Goes Too Far." Memes flooded the internet. A particularly popular one showed Ron's mugshot next to a quote bubble that read, "Skateboarding? Not on my watch." Someone else edited footage of Ron's golf cart with dramatic music and mock movie titles like HOA, First Blood. Back in the neighborhood, the mood was lighter, freer. People smiled more, talked more, let their kids play outside without fear of being filmed by a guy hiding behind a bush. Dylan was back on his skateboard, learning new tricks with friends who now looked at him like some kind of suburban hero. He laughed more. And even though he never said it outright, I could tell he felt safer. Protected. Marissa, despite the praise and attention, kept things low-key. She went back to work, back to her real cases, but people still stopped her in the grocery store to say thank you. Parents sent her handwritten note. One kid made her a drawing of her with a superhero cape and the words, "Best mom agent ever." She hung it on the fridge next to a magnet that read, "No HOA zones ahead." The judge, before closing the trial, offered one final statement that stuck with everyone. He said, "Let this be a reminder that power, real or imagined, without accountability leads only to chaos. And when the law shows up, that power fades fast." It was the perfect bookend to a saga that started with a skateboard and a zip tie. And as we walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, I glanced at Marissa, who was already planning to return home, sip some coffee, and catch up on laundry like none of this had happened. "You done saving the neighborhood?" I asked. "For now," she said. "But let's see what the next HOA tries." And just like that, she walked off with the quiet confidence of someone who doesn't need a badge to prove anything, but knows exactly when to use it. Things didn't go back to normal right away. You can't just pull the mask off a fake authority figure, drag half an HOA into federal court, and expect the next day to be business as usual. But something better happened. The neighborhood started to breathe. People who once kept their heads down began walking with a little more confidence. Front yards turned into meeting spots instead of battlegrounds for petty citations. There were no more anonymous warning letters, no more bogus fines, and definitely no more zip-tie arrests. The spell had been broken, and in its place was something that felt a lot like actual community. Dylan was thriving. What had started as a humiliating and confusing moment on his driveway had evolved into something he could be proud of. He didn't talk about Ron much anymore, not because he was avoiding it, but because he had moved on. The incident had forced him to grow up a little faster than expected, but it also made him sharper, more aware of his rights, and far more confident when dealing with adults who thought they could push him around. He got invited to speak at a youth safety event hosted by the local high school, where he and Marissa stood on stage and answered questions from kids about what to do when someone claims authority without having any. The applause lasted longer than expected. Marissa, ever composed, took the attention in stride. She politely declined interviews from larger networks, saying she hadn't done anything extraordinary, just protected her son. But what people didn't realize was how much she had done behind the scenes. She didn't just clean up a neighborhood, she exposed a culture of fear disguised as order. It wasn't about one man's delusions. It was about the silence everyone had accepted. She broke that silence so thoroughly, it would take years for anyone to try anything like it again. Meanwhile, the Temporary Oversight Committee for the HOA started doing something shocking: listening. They held open meetings, allowed residents to actually vote on issues, and ditched the old cryptic language used to confuse people. They even passed a motion banning any individual from creating or wearing any uniform, badge, or gear that implied legal authority unless it was explicitly authorized by the county. It was called the Ron Rule, and it passed unanimously. One of the more unexpected outcomes was the wave of creativity that followed. A group of teens in the neighborhood, led by Dylan and his friends, started a YouTube channel called Badge and a Lawn Chair. It was a mix of skits, educational content, and reaction videos to viral neighborhood conflict. Their first episode was titled "How to Spot a Fake Cop with a Golf Cart," and it racked up tens of thousands of views. What started as a joke turned into something surprisingly impactful. The kids were learning, creating, and connecting. They had taken a terrible experience and turned it into art, laughter, and a little justice of their own. And then, just when everyone thought the last twist had already unraveled, one more surprise came in the form of a letter. A very official one, embossed with a federal seal. It was addressed to Marissa and arrived by courier. Inside was a formal offer. The Bureau wanted her to lead a new national initiative focusing on suburban authority impersonation and community surveillance violations. Apparently, similar cases had started popping up across the country, and her work had drawn attention at higher levels. She read the letter twice before setting it down quietly on the kitchen table. "I thought I was done with this neighborhood circus," she said with a smirk. I asked her if she was going to take the job. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she poured herself a cup of tea and looked out the window at Dylan, who was skating in the driveway again, free and unbothered. For a moment, there was just silence and the soft clack of skateboard wheels against pavement. "Maybe," she finally said. "But only if they let me work from here." A week later, she accepted the position. Her official title was Director of Community Integrity Oversight, but everyone who knew her just called her the HOA Whisperer. She spent her days reviewing similar cases, developing training materials, and helping other agents navigate the bizarre legal territory of neighborhood power abuse. She became the expert no one knew we needed, and people listened because she had lived it. The best part? Her first field training manual opened with a line that had become legendary in our town. If the guy in khakis with the badge made from a printer ever tells you to get on the ground, ask to see a real one. Ron, meanwhile, had gone silent. No appeals, no public statements, no letters from prison. It was like he evaporated from the community he once tried to control. His house was quietly sold, and the golf cart was auctioned off for charity. Someone even painted it and donated it to the local middle school as a mobile book cart. The kids named it Officer Bookham. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As for the HOA itself, the new leadership kept things practical and fair. They focused on real issues: potholes, broken sprinklers, improving lighting in the park. No one wore badges. No one gave warnings. And when one resident jokingly suggested a neighborhood watchdog patrol, someone else laughed and said, "Only if it's an actual dog." That's when a family adopted a golden retriever named Judge and declared him honorary HOA president. His only policy was belly rubs on Thursdays. Everyone agreed. On the 1-year anniversary of the infamous incident, the community held a block party. There were food trucks, live music, a bounce house, and a dunk tank. The target? A cardboard cutout of Ron in his full fake uniform. Dylan hit the bullseye 3 times in a row. Marissa laughed so hard she had to sit down. The neighborhood felt healed, not just from what happened, but from years of quietly being ruled by fear and nonsense. It wasn't perfect, but it was real now. And real was better than any fantasy of control. As the sun set and the party lights flickered on, I stood with Marissa by the curb and watched the crowd. People hugged. Kids ran free. No one looked over their shoulder. And for the first time in a long time, the air didn't feel heavy with unspoken rules or silent judgment. I turned to her and asked, "Think it'll stay this way?" She didn't hesitate. "Only if we make sure it does." Then she raised her cup of lemonade like a toast and added, "And if anyone shows up with a fake badge again, I'm going to need more zip ties, real ones this time." We both laughed, because sometimes the best justice isn't just served. Sometimes it's celebrated with lemonade, loud music, and a golden retriever running through a sprinkler in a Hawaiian shirt. And just like that, the story that started with one power-hungry man and a skateboard ended with something far better. A neighborhood that finally learned what community was supposed to be.